This is what you should know. Can you compare and contrast how linear and transactional models illustrate key characteristics of communication? Can you describe a variety of communication contexts? How does the changing technology that we use today affect communication? What makes communication effective or ineffective? And what misconceptions about communication did you recognize in your own communication styles? So I hope this is helpful. Read the chapter, spend some time on it. The chapters are not too long, but if you need to break them up into a couple of days of reading, that's fine. But read them. Make sure that you get through the material. There are 5. We will learn the characteristics of communication. We will learn types of communication. We'll think about communication in a changing world. We'll consider communication competence, and then we'll consider misconceptions about communication. When we think about communication, I hope that you realize that communication, by and large, is a positive. It allows you to do good things like share and learn, connect with others, present your identity, establish and meet goals, and influence others. When you think about communication, I hope that you realize that when we do a good job of communication, we are indeed enhancing our lives as well as the lives around us. But when we don't do a good job of communication, the opposite can occur. So one of the reasons you're taking this class is to learn how to share and learn, how to connect with others, how to present your identity, how to establish and meet personal goals, and how to influence others. You'll notice that the assignment for this chapter deals with the video called More Than a Bus Driver. The link may be available to you through this PowerPoint, but it's also down in the assignment section of the chapter section. So you can watch it there. You must watch the video in order to complete the assignment. So make sure that you spend some time, it's a short video, maybe 15 minutes less, that you watch the video so that you can take care of the assignment questions. You'll see that in this video, which is about the bus driver, it's a different look at somebody that we might ignore in most cases, somebody that we might not give a second thought to, somebody who we don't establish relationships with, somebody who we don't have a connection with, somebody that we don't think too much about. We're glad they're there, but they don't necessarily consume much of our thinking processes. So watch this video, and it'll help you answer the questions. In fact, you'll have to watch it to answer the questions for the first assignment. After you've watched the video, I hope that you'll think about what communication has done for you. Do you find that you use communication well? Does it help you make connections, build relationships, live and learn well, establish your identity, influence others? I bet you, for the most part, many of you will have a positive view of how you communicate. And if you feel like you need a little improvement, well, we all do. So that's one of the reasons that you're taking this course. Our authors want us to realize that communication is symbolic. It is a process. It's irreversible. And it's relational. Let's look at these. So when we say communication is symbolic, think about these 2 images here. The image on the left is a traditional image that probably many of us have seen in parking spaces and various other public spaces where we want to make sure a space is reserved for somebody who's using a wheelchair. This newer image on the left has a different look, but it conveys much of the same thinking, doesn't it? It's the same message, but the message is altered, isn't it? Which of these 2 images shows a person who is more active? Which of these 2 images symbolizes a person who is more in control? Which of these 2 images would reflect somebody who is able to do more than the other image? Well, clearly it's this image here on the left. And The reason that our authors point this out to us is that they're wanting us to realize that the symbols that we use, meaning the words we use and the images we use, even our facial expressions and body language, all of those convey information that is interpreted. Communication is a process because there's a beginning, a middle, and sometimes an end. It goes on. It is something that is connected from one thought to the next. It's not something that is static and just comes to a halt in most cases. It's something that we build one experience upon the next experience, and that's why it's called a process. Communication is irreversible. Once we've said it, it's out there. We cannot delete it. It's like ringing a bell. Once the bell has rung, you cannot pull that sound back. So it is irreversible. And lastly, our authors want us to realize that communication is relational. It helps us build relationships. There are two types of models that I want you to learn. The first is the linear model, and it is considered one-way communication. The linear model is in your textbook on page 8, and you need to go look at that image because the image in the PowerPoint will not have a good resolution for you. And the linear model, you'll see that there are components of communication, which include senders and receivers, encoding and decoding, channels, mediated messages, noise, and environment. And you do need to know these terms. This is the vocabulary of communication. So make sure that you read about those starting on page 8 through page 10 of our textbook. There's one thing that you need to notice, though, about this linear model. If you look carefully at the image in the textbook, you'll see that the image has an orange line that goes one way. And that one-way communication is indicating that we send messages and we receive messages, but that we do not necessarily respond to messages. So our authors point us to a more accurate model, and that is called the transactional model. And you'll need to study the transactional model. It's on page 10 of your textbook. And the elements of the transactional model then are discussed between pages 8 and 10. And those elements are the very same as were in the linear model. There are senders and receivers. There's encoding and decoding occurring. There are channels. There are mediated messages. There's noise. And there's an environment. But the difference is that little orange line. Whereas in the linear model, the orange line indicated that the message was going one way. In the transactional model, the message is going both ways. There's an arrowhead on the end of the orange line pointing at both of the communicators. This is indicating that the transactional model has both sending and receiving simultaneously. And simultaneously is the key word there. Simultaneously means that we can both send and receive at the same time. And we do this by adding the process of feedback when we communicate either verbally or non-verbally to the person who has sent us a message. So all communication is going to be transactional. Let me qualify that. All human communication is going to be transactional. We might not always understand the message. We might not even be aware that we're sending feedback back, but we are. And once you stop and think about the transactional model, I think you realize that communication is constantly occurring. Now, one of the words that is in the model that I want to make sure you understand is the word noise. And so our authors ask, how noisy is your communication? Let me describe what noise is. Noise actually is distraction. Noise means anything that is causing the communication to break down. Noise can be literal noise. Let's say I'm talking to you and my phone starts to ring. I'm distracted because my phone is ringing, and you're distracted because my phone is ringing. So that would be literal noise. But there are other distractions, aren't there? Let's say that I'm worried about something, or I have a big test coming up, or I had a fight with my boyfriend. Would those be noise? Would they cause distractions in our communication? Would it make it hard for me to listen or perhaps to speak? Yes, it can. So I want you to focus on the fact that noise is always present, and make sure that you read in our textbook what our authors say about noise. You need to think about 6 forms or types of communication. One is intrapersonal. That means communication within oneself. We all talk to ourselves, if not aloud, at least silently. We all have messages that we only convey within our own brains. Second is dyadic or interpersonal. Dyadic means communication between 2 people, a dyad. Interpersonal could be 3 to 5 people. But in dyadic and interpersonal communication, the communication is very personal, and we have shared opportunities to communicate as both senders and receivers. The third one is considered small group. And in small group, we're talking about more than 2 people, but probably less than 6 people. So we'll say between 3 and 5. And small groups are styles of communication or types of communication when there's less equality in the time that we communicate than we would have experienced in dyadic or interpersonal. But it's still possible for each member of the group to participate fully. The fourth type is called organizational. And organizational can sometimes be referred to as large group. So in large group communication, the communication strategies have to shift, and we have to change the way we're communicating. Think of the difference between having a small group of students get together to study, say 3 to 5 students, and having a larger group, say 10 to 12 students getting together to study. The 2 groups would function differently. They would communicate differently. They might even break up into smaller groups. A group of 12 might break up into 4 groups of 3, right? Because they want to have more opportunity to communicate fully. But in some cases, we can't break up into smaller groups, and we need to learn how to communicate organizationally to those larger groups. The 5th form is public communication, and I want you to think of public speaking, and we will focus on public speaking in 3 presentations, and we have 3 chapters that we'll look at with regard to public speaking. And the last one is mass communication, which really means mediated communication these days. I want you to think of social media, of forms of communication that only occur because we have a device that allows us to communicate. When we think about mediated communication, we're mostly talking about online communication, although it could be the old-fashioned newspaper that perhaps still comes to your house, or a real magazine that comes to your house. But most of us experience mass communication in the form of online communication. And our authors spend a little time talking about that, and I think it's worth pointing out that when we think about social media and social media changes and challenges, that sometimes we're good at this and sometimes we're not. And if you look at pages 13 through 15, you'll see some tips on improving online or mediated mass communication. The questions sometimes deal with how much time are you spending online? Do you spend more time online than you spend face-to-face? Do you communicate better through text messages or your Facebook than you think you would communicate if you had a conversation? These are some challenges for us. Mediated communication, this new form of mass communication, is many times consuming a lot of time in our daily lives, and I think it's worth considering how well are we doing it. Then our authors want to look at competence in communication. And I think it's important for you to realize that there's no one way. There's no ideal way. There are many ways to communicate well. We know that communication is situational, depending upon our circumstances. Sometimes we are better at communicating than other times. It's relational. We communicate differently with different people depending upon our relationship with them. And we also know that communication competence can be learned. In fact, that's why you're here in the class, so that you can learn how to communicate better. Our authors also want us to know that with regard to misconceptions about communication, that sometimes communication does not solve all our problems. Sometimes communication is not always a good thing. Sometimes we use the words that are not the best words to use. Sometimes silence is really actually better. But we have to learn that through experience. So our authors say some misconceptions about communication is that it requires complete understanding. No, we probably won't get to complete understanding. That it won't solve all of our problems, that it's not always a good thing, that the meanings are also in our nonverbal as well as our verbal communication. And sometimes, not more communication, sometimes less communication is better. So that's a preview of the chapter. Let's check your learning.